Hello, everybody, and thank you for listening to the Ketogenic Fasting Project one more time. Today, definitely going to get some hate mail for this one because a lot of people really take exception to calling science a religion, but I'd like to demonstrate how this is exactly what it's become. So, I think what we're seeing is that we're seeing evidence all the time for bad science. I mean, some people are going to call it fake news or whatever, fake science. But what we're finding out is that there's not that level of sort of pristine procedure and honor behind the scenes. There's a certain lack of internal honesty on a lot of people's part. Some of it's just bias. Sometimes people have a hard time seeing past their own bias, and I think we can all understand that. When you start reading a lot of the books like Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes and the subsequent books, The Case Against Sugar and Why We Get Fat, and Nina Teichel's book, The Big Fat Surprise, and many, many other books, the Denise Menger book, Death by Food Pyramid and stuff like that, they point out all kinds of problems with the scientific data, and mostly how the scientific data was sort of represented after it had been collected. The people that interpreted it often presented their take on what the data represented in a very biased or dishonest way, or clearly just were not objective about it. So this is just one example in the realm of nutrition, and it's a nice way to point out how we got where we're at. In particular, I don't think it's really settled on exactly whether saturated fat is really going to have any direct effect on heart disease or not. We do sort of know that in a lot of studies that saturated fat seems to show a protective effect against cancers. So, and also it was believed at one time that the monounsaturated fats from plant oils or seed oils was actually supposed to be better and more protective. But the opposite seems to be true. And so I just like to run through some of the points just to kind of drive home the idea, because when I talk to people about changing their diet, they are afraid of fat, they're afraid of meat, they're afraid of not restricting calories, they're afraid of not eating fiber, they're afraid of all kinds of things. All this fear has been instilled in people on what is often not even flimsy evidence. It's misrepresented data, and there's a lot out there. They've been doing studies, intensive studies for decades now, at least since the 50s. And there's a lot of record and evidence prior to that. Before about 1900, heart attacks were rare. They weren't really even described in the medical literature till I think about 1915. And somehow people get this idea that all of a sudden people, particularly Americans, were eating more meat. But then when you look at the ancestral chain of events before that, we were actually eating a lot more meat before that. So where are all the people that were dying of heart attacks in that gap before, when meat was plentifully available and there was ruminants or herbivores walking around naturally, sort of dominating the landscape? And the reason why I say that science is more like a faith-based religion is because people don't understand science. I make the point all the time that people don't understand economics, and they usually admit that. People don't have a rudimentary understanding of a lot of things. When you start talking about diet with people and you just start talking about the basic macronutrients of protein, fat, and carbohydrate, you realize pretty quickly that most people don't understand that. So I don't know if it's just not taught in school or they didn't learn. I did most of my learning when I got out of school. So, I had a tough time in school. I was not a good student. I had a terrible time reading, and that's a major handicap. The world was not full of video when I was going to school. So, and when I went to college, the disabled student center was not funded, so there was all they did was test me and then let me loose in the wild. So, anyways, since then, my reading skills have gotten better, and there's far more information that's available in audio form and video form. There's just more information available. So, and there's more people to sort of just raise awareness of where to look for that data. But people choose to believe that science is a thing. It's almost like a holy thing, and they expect everybody behind the scenes to be honestly pursuing the scientific method. And people are almost in love with it. But people need to be skeptical of it because it's wholly misrepresented all the time. People tend to put too much faith in white lab coats. We've seen studies where they did that. They're comical. Any sort of uniform that gives you authority or represents um, some sort of power or knowledge tends to encourage people to faithfully listen and believe without questioning. Letters after names, public figures, politicians, learning institutions, government agencies, people put way too much faith in this stuff and they're not critical of the information on their own. People choose to believe it is pure and honest and accurate when it often, or probably more than likely, is not. People need to check the facts and be skeptical. People assume the scientific method is used, and oftentimes the methods are not scientific. People do not really know what science is, so they consider it science anyways. People say stuff all the time like, well, science proves this and science proves that, and they have no idea what they're talking about. It's obvious. Just try and have an in-depth conversation with people about most topics, and you'll see what I'm talking about. People assume all the results of the research is published, and this isn't true either. A lot of research is buried because the people who funded it or the people doing the research didn't get the results they want, and so they bury it. They publish it 10 years later, 15 years later. And on top of that, people cherry pick data looking for the results they want. People assume that scientists themselves as persons are not biased, and they often are. A lot of times you just read the abstract on scientific studies and you see the blatant bias right there. And I'm not necessarily saying all bias is bad, especially if they're upfront about it, but that's exactly what you're looking for in the interpretation of the data at the end is, were they looking at this in a biased way, or does this really work out statistically? And most times when they do a study, no matter what the results, it suggests a direction. It doesn't necessarily prove something. Sometimes it actually does prove things, but that's generally the exception. But most people don't know that. People assume the conclusion of abstracts in the studies are accurate. And again, you got to look for the bias. You got to look for the obvious that's often ignored. Sometimes they pick up on a tiny detail that sort of hints in the direction they want, and they go, look, our study demonstrates exactly what we thought, and then they ignore the elephant. So anybody can read studies. It really does not take that long to understand what you're reading. It doesn't take that much effort, and they're widely available. The other thing is, we all have this assumption that somebody checked their work. Some government board was looking over their shoulder, some sort of group of peers, some smart guy in a chair in a smoking jacket went through it with a fine-tooth comb. This just doesn't really happen. And yet, when you read about a lot of the original nutritional studies and you talk about just like the period of time when Ansel Keys was very, and his work was very popular, there were a lot of dissenters. There was, if you go back, you find out, or you read a book like Good Calories, Bad Calories, you find out that there were opposing views published at the time, but they're eventually drowned out and forgotten. A lot of that happened, of course, in that particular case, is well before I was born. So if somebody doesn't come along and write a book about it, I may never find that information. People also rely very heavily on peer-reviewed journals, and when you start reading articles about the peer-reviewed journals, you find out how disappointed many times the peers that review the journals are disappointed. So on one hand, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not the be all end all of keeping people honest and accurate. So it's really just one step in a system of checks and balances. People automatically have faith in white lab coats or some initials behind their name and diplomas from universities. This is why science has become a faith-based religion. All these things we think are behind science, making it accurate and pure. And when we hear an article that claims to have a scientific result, oftentimes it doesn't really tell you that much about the actual data. It's just a report about somebody's opinion about a study, and then we find out they got a diploma from a fancy university, or they work for some fancy research group, and they got some initials behind their name, and then we're supposed to believe it. And this is what's led to what's been going on, particularly in the realm of nutrition. People just don't read this stuff for themselves. A great example, I'll bring it up again. When I started reading books on nutrition, quite a number of people said, "Oh, you really got to read the China study." The China study is a big book. It's well known. It's widely quoted. I read the book. I read books about the book. I read some of the data that the book is based on. And I don't think too many people these days would read the China study and the book itself and the claims that the author makes and think that he's clearly correct, or that he's not overly biased, because to me it was pretty clear, and I would assume most people would read that and kind of raise an eyebrow to it. But other people have already torn that book apart from up one side down the other. In fact, I think Denise Manger did a couple of lectures on that and probably wrote extensively about it online. So that's a good example. And then I come to find out that I couldn't find anybody who recommended that book to me who had actually even read the book, much less looked at any of the data. And then it's like, wait a minute here. Everybody's telling everybody, oh yeah, you should eat this type of diet. You should read this book, blah blah blah. And then you kind of find out they didn't read it. They heard it mentioned. They don't know hardly anything about it. So, anyways, I think this is one of the biggest problems. People don't understand things on a level that allows them to be critical with important subjects like health. And that's mostly what I make my videos about, is about health, about diet, and about trying to resolve symptoms. And I think that at large, people in modern day kind of suffer from a certain level of ignorance when we live in the information age. So I blame the people. I mean, as I blame us. I think people are kind of vapid and lazy for the most part. And everybody loves to get outraged when they see some kind of trigger word or something like that. And they pile on one bandwagon or another, and they've got to believe this, they got to believe that, they got to be a vegan, or they got to be they got to believe that meat's good for you, or it's good for you in moderation, or whatever. But the truth is that there's a lot of information out there to be had, and most people just aren't doing any work. They aren't really even experimenting on themselves, much less trying to learn. Here's a good example where anybody can look stuff up. This website, PubMed, widely quoted. Um, you can go in there and you can find studies that other people cite, or you can just make up criteria on your own. I even went in there and looked up to see if they had done any work on the nutrition of mammoth meat. And there are several studies that were done on looking at the actual flesh of mammoth, woolly mammoths, to see how nutritious it was. So you can literally go in there and look for all kinds of stuff. And there's many other places. This is another one, the Cochrane Library. There's quite a few studies that you'll find there. Like I said, this is the information age, right? You should check people on what they say. You know, you should not just accept that. I mean, really, when I see a box of cereal and it says it's heart healthy, I gotta think. I seriously doubt it, and I think the number of people that I believe that is getting fewer and fewer. But every time I go to the store, I see grocery carts with cereal in it, and I mean, a lot of this cereal is just crap with a bunch of sugar on it. You know, it's chocolate encrusted, whatever. You know, this is the kind of stuff that I honestly believe makes people sick. Now I'm on a carnivore diet. I'm doing really well. I feel better than I have in 20 years. I seem to be losing body fat and putting on muscle. My psoriasis seems to be going away. But that's a big step, you know. And I don't do this blindly. I get heat from people for saying that what I'm doing is an experiment, as though I had to join this group, this carnivore group, and I have to be a permanent member or something, or I'm just a jerk for saying it's an experiment. I don't understand it. But anyways, I'm doing this looking for results, and I think I have some very good ideas on why this will work and why this is healthy. So, anyways, I'm done beating up science for the moment, and I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope that this information really does help somebody, and um, please give me a like on my videos, subscribe to my channel, and maybe pass the links on to somebody else that you think will find it beneficial. Thanks.